The olive trees are old. Some of the trees still standing in that garden today have roots that go back 2,000 years. The same roots, the same ground, the same dark. It was night. The city was quiet on the other side of the valley. The disciples had followed Jesus across the Kidron brook and into the garden, and then they had fallen asleep. 3 times he would come back to them. 3 times they would be asleep. He stopped waking them. Jesus went further in, alone. What happened next, Mark records with a precision that is almost uncomfortable. Jesus threw himself on the ground, not kneeled, threw himself down. And then, before anything else, before the long prayer, before the sweat like drops of blood, before the words, "Let this cup pass from me," there is one word. One single word. Mark writes it in Aramaic, not Greek, Aramaic, the language Jesus spoke at home, at the dinner table, in the market, with his mother. Mark then translates it immediately into Greek for his audience, because his audience was not Aramaic speaking. He does not want them to miss it. But that word, the Aramaic word, he kept, raw, transliterated, exactly as Jesus said it. He did not replace it. Scholars have been sitting with that editorial decision for 2,000 years. Why did Mark preserve it? Why not just translate it cleanly and move on? He was already translating everything else, because there was something in that word that Greek could not carry. And here is what nobody tells you. That word, the word Jesus chose in the darkest moment of his life, was not a theological declaration. It was not a formal title. It was not the language of liturgy or law or sacred scripture. It was the first word a child learned to say, and in the entire recorded history of Jewish prayer before that night, no one had ever used it to address God. Not once. To understand what Jesus did in that garden, you have to understand what language meant in first century Palestine. Jesus of Nazareth was a Galilean Jew. That is not a small detail. Galilee was the north, rougher terrain, mixed population, closer to the trade routes, more Aramaic and daily life than the more Hellenized regions of the south. Jesus grew up hearing 3 languages around him. Aramaic was the language of home. Hebrew was the language of scripture, of synagogue readings, of the sacred text. Greek was the language of commerce, of the Roman administration, of the wider Mediterranean world. These were not interchangeable. Each language carried a different register, different weight, different social meaning. When Jesus taught in the villages, he used Aramaic. When he stood up in the synagogue at Nazareth to read from Isaiah, he read Hebrew. When he stood before Pontius Pilate, the conversation was almost certainly conducted in Greek, because Pilate did not speak Aramaic, and Jesus, as we know from the Gospel accounts, did not need an interpreter. Language choice was not neutral. It signaled something about what was happening and who you were speaking to. And in Jewish religious life, the way you addressed God was governed by a deep sense of reverence that had been building for centuries. The names of God in the Hebrew scriptures were not casual vocabulary. Adonai, El Shaddai, El Elyon, Hashem, the name. A substitute used because the actual divine name was considered too holy for ordinary speech. The Tetragrammaton, the 4 Hebrew letters representing the personal name of God, had not been pronounced aloud by ordinary Jews in public for generations. By the time Jesus was born, only the high priest once a year on Yom Kippur in the Holy of Holies spoke it aloud. That was the atmosphere. The formal prayers of the synagogue were carefully structured. The Kaddish, one of the oldest Jewish prayers still recited today, opens by exalting and sanctifying the greatness of God's name. The Amidah, the standing prayer recited 3 times daily by observant Jews in the 1st century, begins, "Blessed are you, Lord our God and God of our fathers, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and God of Jacob, the great, mighty, and awesome God." That is how you addressed God. With lineage, with history, with the weight of the covenant, with language that acknowledged the distance between you and the one you were addressing. There was warmth in the tradition. There was intimacy in the Psalms, in the anguished prayers of the prophets, in the raw laments of the suffering. The God of Israel was not an absent deity, but the address, the opening word, the title, reflected the architecture of holiness. Joachim Jeremias was a German New Testament scholar who taught at the University of Göttingen in the mid-20th century. He spent years, not months, years, systematically examining every surviving text of Jewish prayer from the Second Temple period. The Dead Sea Scrolls, the Mishnah, the Targums, the Apocrypha, the literature of the synagogue, the private devotional texts. He was looking for one thing, a single instance of a Jewish person addressing God as Abba in prayer. He could not find one, not one example. In all of that literature, stretching across centuries, covering everything from the most formal temple liturgy to the most private personal prayer, no one had addressed God with that word. And then Jesus walked into a garden and said it out loud. The garden exists today. You can walk into it. Gethsemane, in Aramaic, Gat Shmanim. Oil press. It was a working olive grove, not a decorative space. A place where olives were brought after harvest and crushed under heavy stone wheels to extract the oil. It sat on the lower slopes of the Mount of Olives, just across the Kidron Valley from the eastern wall of Jerusalem, close enough to the city that you could see the torchlight from the temple courts on a clear night. Pilgrims have been visiting this site since at least the 4th century. Egeria, a Christian pilgrim who traveled to Jerusalem around 381 CE, describes the church built on the spot. The Church of All Nations, built by an Italian architect in 1924, over what tradition identifies as the Rock of the Agony, still stands there today. Inside, the floor is intentionally dim. They wanted the effect of night. The olive trees are part of the history in their own right. An Italian research team working in 2012 used carbon-14 analysis on core samples from the largest trees still standing in the garden. Their findings confirmed that at least 3 of the trees date to around the 12th century CE. The root systems are likely older. The original trunks from the 1st century were almost certainly destroyed during the Roman siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE, when Josephus records in his Jewish War that the Roman general Titus ordered every tree in the vicinity of the city cut down for siege fortifications. The ground was stripped bare, but the roots held. Some of what is in the ground in Gethsemane today was in the ground when Jesus was there. And it is here, in this specific place, that the Gospel of Mark makes an unusual editorial decision. Mark 14:36, in the original Greek manuscript, Abba, ho pater, panta dynatasoi. Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Mark writes Abba in Aramaic. Then he writes ho pater, the Greek word for father, immediately after, as a translation. He's explaining the Aramaic word to his Greek reading audience. The Aramaic is not incidental. It is the first word of the prayer. It is preserved as the original sound Jesus made in that garden. This pattern appears 3 times in the New Testament. Mark 14:36, Romans 8:15, Galatians 4:6. 3 different authors, 3 completely different contexts. In all 3, the Aramaic word Abba is written out, followed immediately by the Greek translation. The early Christian communities were careful with this word. They did not let it disappear into Greek. Whatever was in it, they wanted it preserved. The Babylonian Talmud, compiled centuries after the 1st century, but preserving oral traditions that often reach much further back, records in Tractat Berakot a discussion that illuminates what the word Abba meant in daily speech. The rabbis distinguish between the term for father used in formal and legal contexts and the term used by small children at home. The text describes how toddlers learn to speak. Their first words, Ima, Abba, mother, father, not formal titles, the first syllables a child's mouth can produce. Abba was not a respectful address. It was a child's word, warm, immediate, assuming closeness before it assumed anything else. The Dead Sea Scrolls give us the clearest window we have into the devotional vocabulary of Jewish communities living at the same time as Jesus. The community rule, designated 1 QS by scholars, contains detailed instructions for communal prayer and spiritual discipline. The Hodayot, the Thanksgiving hymns, are among the most emotionally rich texts in the collection, full of personal confession and praise. These were not public liturgies. These were private prayers from people who took their relationship with God with absolute seriousness. In none of these texts does the word Abba appear as a form of address to God, not in the liturgies, not in the hymns, not in the private prayers. The Qumran community addressed God with titles of power and majesty. They did not call him by the word a toddler uses at dinner time. That is the world Jesus was speaking into. And that makes what happens in the garden and what he taught his disciples afterward something that has no parallel before him in the historical record. Let us go back to the garden. It is late. Jesus has been in Jerusalem for days. He knows exactly what is coming. He said it plainly to the disciples twice during the journey south, once at Caesarea Philippi, once on the road down from Galilee. He told them he was going to Jerusalem to die. They did not want to hear it. Peter rebuked him for saying it the first time. They argued about which of them would be greatest in the kingdom. They did not understand. He did. He walks into the garden. He tells most of the disciples to sit and wait. He takes Peter, James, and John a little further. And then he leaves even them. He goes alone. Mark says something here that most readers pass over quickly. He says Jesus began to be deeply distressed and troubled. The Greek word is ektambaustei, a word that suggests being overwhelmed, almost beside yourself. And alongside it a demonine, to be in anguish, to feel utterly lost. These are not polished, composed words. Mark is describing a man in the grip of something severe. He falls to the ground. And before anything else, before the theological content of the prayer, before the submission, before any of the words that the Church has been meditating on for 2,000 years, the first word is Abba. Joachim Jeremias, after his exhaustive search through ancient Jewish literature, wrote this conclusion. The address Abba as a form of prayer to God is without precedent in the whole of Jewish literature. Jesus spoke to God as a child speaks to its father. Simply, intimately, securely. Simply, intimately, securely. in a garden, in the dark, alone. With soldiers already on their way through the city, he chose the most intimate word available to him in his language. He chose it in the moment when he had nothing left to hide behind. No audience, no disciples watching carefully, no scribes waiting to catch him on a technicality, no crowd needing something from him. Just the word. And that word was not a theological argument. It was not a claim about the nature of the divine. It was the same word a frightened child uses when they wake up in the dark and call out before they have time to be afraid of calling out. It assumed that someone was there before the sentence was finished, before the question was even formed. Abba. And then, and this is the part that changes the entire shape of everything that follows, he taught his disciples to use it. The prayer that Christians have been reciting for 2,000 years begins, in Luke's version, with the Greek word pater, Father. Luke is writing for a Greek-speaking audience. But the Aramaic-speaking communities who first received that prayer, the disciples in that room in Jerusalem, the earliest church in Galilee, knew what word Jesus used when he said, "When you pray, say this." He used Abba. He handed his disciples the most intimate word in the Aramaic vocabulary and told them this was how they were to begin when they spoke to God. Not after extensive preparation, not after acquiring the right level of religious standing. This word, this posture, this assumption of nearness was how they were to approach from the first syllable. That is not a small instruction. If you have found something today that you did not expect, subscribe. Every video on this channel is built around the same question. What did we lose in translation? The answers are not always comfortable, but they are always worth finding. Subscribe and stay for what is coming next. Paul of Tarsus wrote his letter to the Romans around 57 CE. He had never been to Rome. He was writing to a community of believers he had never met, in a city he had never visited, trying to explain something that most of them had probably not worked through the way he had. And in the middle of a careful argument about what the Spirit does in the life of a believer, he reaches for a word. Not a concept, not a Greek theological term, an Aramaic word. Romans 8:15. For you did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have received the spirit of adoption as sons, by whom we cry, Abba, Father. He writes it in Aramaic, in a Greek letter, to Roman readers. He knows they will not know what it means. He translates it immediately, and yet he includes the Aramaic anyway, because the translation alone was not enough. 3 years later, writing to the churches of Galatia, Paul does the same thing again. Galatians 4:6. And because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of His Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. Same word. Same refusal to let it disappear into Greek. In both cases, Paul is not talking about Jesus. He is talking about ordinary believers. He is making the argument that the same address Jesus used, the unprecedented, unparalleled, never before spoken in Jewish prayer address, now belongs to everyone who follows him. Paul had been trained under Gamaliel, one of the most respected rabbis of the first century in Jerusalem. He knew the tradition better than almost anyone writing in the New Testament. He knew exactly how extraordinary the claim was. He was making it anyway. The tradition he was trained in understood holiness as distance. Not cold distance, not indifferent distance, but real distance. God was not familiar. The approach required the right words, the right time, the right preparation. The high priest went into the Holy of Holies once a year, and even then with incense smoke filling the chamber so that the presence would not be seen directly. That was how serious the distance was. Paul is saying, in both letters, with the same Aramaic word, that something has changed in the access. And he reaches for the most intimate word in the Aramaic vocabulary to describe it. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the 5th century, reflected at length on the Lord's Prayer and the address to God as Father. He observed that calling God Father at all implied something about what the believer had become. Not a servant before a master, but a child before a parent. The word carried the relationship inside it. Abba carries that at an even more fundamental level. It does not just say Father, it says the version of Father that assumes nearness, before it assumes anything else. Jesus used it alone in the garden the night he was betrayed. Paul said that same word now lived in the hearts of people who had never been to Galilee, who had never heard Jesus speak, who were meeting in houses in Rome and Galatia and Corinth, passing around letters written in Greek from a man they had never met. And that Aramaic word was there, in the middle of those letters, like something that had traveled further than anyone planned for it to travel. The question that remains, the one history and archaeology and linguistics can gesture toward but not answer, is this. If that word means what it means, and if Jesus chose it deliberately, and if Paul carried it into every community he wrote to, what were they trying to say about the kind of relationship that had become possible? And what does it mean that it began in a garden, in the dark, from a man lying face down on the ground? Here is what we know. On the night before he died, Jesus walked into a garden on the side of a mountain. The city was behind him. The disciples were asleep. He had nothing to perform, no audience to teach, no argument to win, no miracle to demonstrate. He fell to the ground. And the first word was not a title. It was not a formal address. It was not the language of liturgy or law or centuries of carefully constructed reverence. It was the word a child uses at the end of a bad dream, the word that assumes, before anything else is said, before the full sentence is even formed, that someone is there, that they will hear, that they will come, that they have not left. Abba. 2,000 years of translation turned that into Father, a noun, a role, a theological category. The Aramaic kept something that translation could not hold. The sound of a child who has not yet learned to be afraid to ask. That is what Mark preserved in his manuscript. That is what Paul carried into his Greek letters for communities who had never been to Galilee and never heard Jesus speak in any language. That is what the early church refused to replace, not because they lacked the Greek vocabulary, but because they understood that the Greek word was not the same thing. The word crossed languages and centuries because it was carrying something larger than its meaning. If this is your first time here, subscribe. Every week this channel goes back to the original languages, the manuscripts, and the archaeological record to find what was there before the translation decisions were made. Sometimes the discovery is historical. Sometimes it changes the way you read a text you have known your whole life. Subscribe and you will not miss what is coming next. Because next week we are going to a different shore entirely. The Sea of Galilee, early morning, the smell of fish and smoke and a fire of coals burning on the beach. A man standing there who just days earlier had denied knowing Jesus 3 times, the last time under oath. He went back to his boat after everything, back to his nets, back to before any of this started. And Jesus is standing on the shore, and he asks Peter a question. 3 times. Every English translation in the world makes those 3 questions identical. Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? But the Greek text is not identical. Jesus uses one word the first 2 times, a different word the 3rd time. And when he changes the word, when he reaches for the smaller, quieter, less demanding word, that is the moment the text says, Peter was grieved. Not the first question, not the second, the 3rd, the one where Jesus changed the word. What those 2 Greek words are, why the change broke Peter more than the repetition, and what Jesus was actually doing on that beach, a story that English has been telling wrong for centuries. That is next.